Today we're airing an interview I held back in March with Melissa James, the CEO of the Tech Connection. Melissa is a diversity and equity champion for the New England area, and she taught me about gaining alignment for D&I initiatives, what the Rooney Rule is, and what to do about the number one challenge for diversity initiatives, accountability. I can't wait for you to meet her. I am so excited to be sitting here with Melissa James, the CEO of the Tech Connection. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You're the co-founder of Hack Diversity, and you founded the Black Tech Boston Meetup. How'd you get into this line of work?
Oh man, so I've always loved diversity recruitment from a very young age. When I actually, believe it or not, like my family came here, migrated from Jamaica, and it was because of a job opportunity that changed my grandma's life. My grandma worked as a maid for a very wealthy family out in Brookline. They brought her here, and for me, job opportunities and having access to them is something that's so important.
Well, it's great. It was the matriarch who brought you here.
Oh, absolutely. And it was something that I've always thought about. So when I was like first in my family to go to college, first in my family to work in corporate America, like I just realized that having the right job opportunity could change your life. I came from a background where my family members were working 2-3 jobs just to get by, to put food on the table. And when I finally started getting my own first job and making a salary, I realized how important it is to find a job that makes you, one, feel alive, that you can be your best self, and then also really helping you to understand more about like who you are as an individual. I didn't need to work 2 or 3 jobs. How awesome is that because of my parents' sacrifice, I had the option to choose a job opportunity for me. So for me, at the core, I've always known how important I always knew how important job opportunities were.
Right.
Diversity came into it because of the experience that I saw through my grandmother, through my parents. So when I think about like how I can share my gifts with the world, it was certainly about helping people make smart choices on how they spend their time at work.
Well, clearly, you get to see a lot of companies doing things right and wrong.
All the time.
And you've got such a perspective on this. So let's go deep on this. And my first question is, as a CEO in tech, or maybe it's a chief people officer in tech, but someone who really cares about the strategic talent they're putting, on the playing field every day, why should they want to put more resources into DEI?
Absolutely, and like I should give some background, like what does Tech Connection do, and like tell people more about
please,
it.
Yeah.
But yeah, Tech Connection is a recruitment platform that matches diverse talent to tech companies. So we really focus on figuring out like where are the talent that we need within our workforce, how can we bring them in when they have a different background, when they have a different educational experience, how do we make sure that companies are assessing talent truly for who they are. So when we think about talent acquisition and we work with different companies, oftentimes the CEO who gives us a phone call and says, hey, I know that workforce development is really important. I've got quite the range of things that are happening right now. I have millennials that are coming into the workforce that are ready to climb the ladder. I've got baby boomers that are leaving the workforce, but I still have them here on my payroll and I want to upskill them, but I'm not exactly sure how. And then I also have this other group of folks that are trying to kind of figure out like, what's my passion? Where do I go? How do I focus on career development when I don't necessarily have a large budget to dedicate to career development? So I think for many companies, we're going through a lot of changes in 2020 when it comes to our workforce. So when they start thinking about like, what are my priorities on how do I make sure that one, my workforce is happy, they're engaged, and they're productive in their work, I think companies are really starting to think about like, how do I make sure that my candidates and my employees feel like they can be their best self.
So is it often the first entry point is to you from a company is the CEO?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it comes from the top.
Oh yeah.
What percentage of CEOs are enlightened?
Yeah, that's a great question. It kind of ranges. I have to say that we're very lucky to be here in Boston where I think CEOs are constantly thinking about ways to improve. I would probably say about 20% of our phone conversations start off with a CEO just saying like, hey, I want to talk more about this, but I don't know how, and I don't know exactly how I want to go about creating this strategy. I just know it's important. So when I think about CEOs investing in this and what they need to do, it's certainly paying attention to the workforce trends. By 2040, we'll be majority minority. So now our experiences are going to be more diverse in the workplace. We're going to have a more diverse workforce. It's important for our leaders to start thinking about how that's going to change. We are 20 years away from it, so we have a lot to think about.
So if I'm a CEO. I come to you,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I want to get started. What are the sort of 2, 3, 4 things that I should be thinking about early on, to get started? If I have no program, I know it's important. It's going to make me better, but what do I do?
Yeah, great question. I always say that let's start with alignment first. Have you done an assessment of your team to understand their thoughts on D&I and inclusion? So when I think about it, I always say you should have leadership interviews done. Make sure that you kind of understand who's really a diversity champion, who are people that are curious to learn more but haven't had the opportunity, and who are some of the people that are we just don't need this right now. It's not important, because you really want to understand the climate of your leadership team on this particular topic so that you can hear their inside thoughts and then design a strategy that's unique to your team on how you want to go about addressing D&I. Some folks will do an assessment and then realize hey, we need to go through and create a strategy on this, or maybe we need to talk about unconscious bias and do some trainings on that before we do a deeper dive into understanding recruitment and hiring and understanding inclusion practices. There's a lot that goes into this work, so I always suggest to a company start off doing an assessment to understand what's going on. Do your leadership interviews, then go through, sit down, chat with your actual focus groups, sit down and talk to the underrepresented talent within your organization, and have an outside consultant do it. You don't have to do it because you want them to feel safe and comfortable to have those conversations, to kind of get a bird's eye view of so what is leadership saying versus what our team is saying, so that we can figure out what's the right plan for our company at this date and time.
Do you see managers who might get dragged along where they might have tacit approval, but they're really not on board?
Oh, absolutely.
And these are the middle managers who are probably doing most of the hiring.
Absolutely. So when it comes to talent acquisition, we see it in different ways. So we can get buy-in from a CEO that's yes, I absolutely want to do it. And then what we'll see when it comes to a company saying, we want to implement a diversity recruitment effort, this is important to us, CEO has said it, there's been communication about it. What can happen is, if you didn't do that temperature check beforehand, that hiring manager will be oh, I'm not interviewing that candidate. Oh no, I already have somebody in line that I want to have come in and interview for this role. We're not really
just
prioritizing
exception.
Absolutely. So that's why it's important to have alignment throughout the organization, making sure that your CEO is on board, and then also understanding what is the current climate and temperature that we have right now. And then most companies will choose to understand this is my temperature check, this is where our starting point is. Let that be your baseline to inform the strategy moving forward. So I always suggest to CEOs, if you're just getting started, let's do a temperature check of where we are. Let's figure out what our next best step will be, and decide and design on strategy for the year. If we can design what our strategy will be, it'll influence our next best step on addressing diversity and inclusion within organizations.
Yeah, we totally recommend companies start with strategy when they're going into their hiring program. So if smaller companies are probably so resource constrained. So you get this alignment, most recruiters are being paid on time to fill.
Yeah.
But really doing DEI right is going to take time. So what recommendations are you making, again, to the CEO or the head of talent about that? So they have alignment.
Yep.
But now what?
So how do we hold everyone accountable to it is the big question. How do we make sure that we actually dedicate time, resources, and budget to executing this? And I think oftentimes in companies we're moving so quickly, so fast, that time to fill needs to come down. We needed these people yesterday. That's always the feedback that we hear from management. However, if we don't dedicate budget, dedicate time and resources to it, it'll always be something that we continue to struggle with. So I've now seen companies implement rules around how do we make sure that diversity and inclusion is top of mind? How do we make sure that we do it by business department? Because our diversity recruitment strategy would be different depending on which department we're talking to. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we design the diversity recruitment strategy, and then how do we dedicate the time and the resources to it? Because each different business unit might take longer or maybe shorter, depending on where the market is today for talent and what our strategy is to getting there.
Right. So, as you know, at PI, we have a behavioral and a cognitive assessment, among other things. Yeah. The cognitive assessment biases on socioeconomics,
Yeah.
especially in language.
Oh, sure.
So, and unfortunately, when you bias in socioeconomics in the United States, you're unintentionally biasing against race and ethnicity.
Yeah, totally.
So, like as a CEO, I'm like, what is if I'm bought in to DEI, I want to get to the macro versus micro. Do I take 10% of our profits and donate it to the macro issue, which might be our educational system and income inequality?
Sure.
Or do I deal with the micro, which is, listen, we'll just make our company great and do a great thing and make that change in that way? How do I think about balancing these?
I think you have to do both, is my answer, because I think we come to work between 9 and 5, we spend a lot of our time here, but if we're not engaged in our community, I think we feel a different type of way about it. And we do owe it back to our community that we are engaged and that we are dedicating our time and budget to it. Because at the end of the day, human capital is what we make it. And if we don't invest in that as a workforce, I think that we'll be doing a disservice to future generations. So when I think about like how do we go about dedicating budget and resources and people, I certainly think there's a lot of internal work. It's just like your own personal development. You got to do some internal work before you go out and say, I want to get married to someone. You got to know what your values are. You got to know what you stand for. You got to know what things you are okay with. So when I think about how do you go about doing this, it's certainly thinking through like, have I done an assessment of like what's going on and within my own company? Have we set our own priorities and strategies so that when we do go out into the community, we're all on the same page in alignment on how we discuss our commitment to diversity and inclusion out in the public? So I personally believe start with internal first. You absolutely have to do the external work. I think they can happen in tandem, but I'd be very thoughtful about how you dedicate your time and your budget to it so that you can get to that place. But I do believe that you need to do both.
Yeah, it's just scarier to just send funds out to be like, fix the world. Like the world seems dysfunctional about
There's so many issues.
So many issues. Internally, you feel like you have control over it. So now, let's just say hypothetically, I'm an enlightened CEO. I want to do this. We do this alignment. What are some of the biggest change management obstacles that we run into in companies?
Yeah, we talked about the naysayers, right? And I think oftentimes, like everybody likes to assume that everyone's on board with D&I. They would absolutely love to do it, but really our naysayers sometimes are a little bit more quiet. They'll say comments like, well, why do we need to make this a priority? This isn't important right now. We just hire based off of merit. That's all that matters. And they're kind of like discounting that diversity matters. And when you see that, that's an opportunity for us to educate and build awareness around why diversity matters, why unconscious bias is important for us to discuss, how to be respectful in the workplace. Because I'm sure if you ask someone from an underrepresented background, when you hear that I just got hired based off of merit, like they might feel differently about that. It's like, no, I worked extremely hard for this. And actually like my experience during the hiring process might be very different. So when I think about, implementing diversity and inclusion strategies, it always falls short at middle managers. That sometimes it can be hard to see whether or not they are truly on board with diversity recruitment or if they're hindering it in many ways. So I think it's important for us to understand and to listen to those naysayers of like, what do they feel uncomfortable with? Because they're telling you.
Right.
And they're saying it to you, but oftentimes we're like, oh, no, but he's a great person. So like, he's just saying that. And it's okay to say those comments. And it's actually not. It's an opportunity to increase awareness and to do education around D&I 101, unconscious bias, making sure that you're being respectful in the workplace. Those are all trainings that people could benefit from if they really take the time to invest in that learning for senior
Do you run
leaders.
hiring trainings to help people identify unconscious bias and at least make it conscious? So
Absolutely. Unconscious bias in recruitment is a huge topic. I think that for many companies, they've always looked at the resume. The resume is filled with opportunities where bias can creep in, looking at a person's name, where they grew up, what school they went to, what company they worked for, all create opportunity for us to say, oh, I like this person because they went to my school, they worked at a previous company.
Affinity you might
that
have.
natural affinity, absolutely. And in your mind, you're giving them a gold star because they seem like you. So it's very important where we walk through and say, like, here's a resume of a candidate that you're looking at this resume right now. What's the story that you articulate in your mind before meeting this candidate? And it's fascinating to hear the assumptions that we make and how quickly we get there. I'll give you an example. So I had a resume up of a candidate, no name on it, and all you could see was the experience, and you could see that they had worked like in a restaurant, changing their job every 3 months, and at the bottom had done some IT work at a company, and then at the very, very bottom, he wrote like associate's degree at Bunker Hill Community College. So in the hiring manager's minds, they're all reading over this resume. They're like, oh my goodness, he just jumps all over the place. He's not going to stay here for a long time. That data point was there, absolutely. And then as you read through, you see that he has a little bit of networking experience. This is the job that he was going for. He did have some experience, and his degree was in network operations. And nobody had even read that bottom little line that said that he had gotten his associates there.
But the associates community college, he probably paid for his way through college and was sort of bootstrapping it.
Absolutely.
That's probably the story of sort of grit and determination to put yourself through college.
Absolutely. So when they went through, they said absolutely not. When we use what we call our new GPA to assess the candidate, I establish a framework for how people should think about diversity and inclusion. I call it grit, perseverance, and ambition. That's the new GPA in my opinion. Where do you see that this candidate may have demonstrated grit, may have demonstrated perseverance, may have demonstrated ambition? And that's exactly what came out. Well, hold on. There's a completely other narrative that we didn't even think about that this person may have had. And what actually happened was we sat down and had this candidate tell their story. And their story was like, I was going to school and I needed to take care of my family, so I worked these 2 jobs. I didn't realize that I should have probably put my networking experience at the top instead of at the bottom, but I just wanted to be honest about what I did. I was actually at the time learning English. This was my second language.
Yeah.
I was listening to Rosetta Stone every single day as I was going to work so that I could perfect my English, so that I could feel comfortable. I chose to work into a restaurant so I could have conversation and practice speaking English with people
so this person's
that didn't
GPA
know.
with grit, perseverance.
Totally, it was
and
completely
ambition is
different.
off the
And
chart.
his framework was completely different than what anyone imagined. So all of the negative assumptions, all of a sudden you were like, wait, hold on. This person is going above and beyond to practice and to learn in ways that are different than what I might have thought. And all of a sudden they were like, wait, I want to hire this person. It's like, well, wait. Hold on, when we looked at his resume, it was a very different story versus who he is as an individual. And I think it's so important for people to get beyond just the resume of getting to know individuals.
So where do you hope we are in 10 years? You're pouring so much of your personal lifeblood into this, and positively impacting the New England community. Like, where do you hope we get to? Is there do we break through something? What happens next?
It's such a very big question. And, of course, I think everybody says that I just wish that we didn't have to do this work and that we don't have to have this conversation in the future. I hope so. But guess what? I'm also very pragmatic. The conversation around D&I has been going on for many years. We are just now walking into the awareness state that hold on, this is an issue and it should be addressed. I think it's going to take us another 20 to 30 years for us to deepen our understanding.
It's going to take that long.
Oh, absolutely. We are just now touching the iceberg when it comes to D&I. And what I love about future generations is that they're not tolerating the PC answers anymore. They expect a change. They want to see a change. They want to see action happen within an organization. So they're actually holding us accountable to D&I in their own ways, in their own experiences. And I love that because now they won't come to work if they don't feel like they can be their authentic self. They're saying, I don't care about a corporate job. I'd rather just travel. Those values are important to me. So as our workforce is changing, I think our millennial leaders are really pushing an agenda of accountability and wanting to see change. And I think that's just something that I'm really excited about.
That's great.
And I think that leaders are going to have to pay attention if they want to keep that competitive advantage in the workplace. So I'm excited about millennials saying, I don't want to do that, and that doesn't work for me.
So I'm out on the stump a lot, speaking to people about talent, about best practices in human resources. What should I add to my stump about this so that I can, and our audience, be evangelists for this?
Absolutely. Let's identify who are your diversity champions within the organization. Let's think through what are pragmatic ways that we can hold ourselves accountable to achieving our diversity recruitment goals. Some ways that I've seen companies go about doing it is using the Rooney Rule. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, so the Rooney Rule, so this is one or more of your finalists for a role must represent bringing diversity to a team in certain demographic categories. So tell us about how this plays in action.
Yeah, absolutely. So a company might say, I'm hiring for sales. We know that typically, generally speaking, sales is predominantly male. They might say that we want to get to 50% women candidates before making a hiring decision on this next role and next opportunity. I think that's a great way to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable, that we're expanding our outreach
Especially
to
when it's
diversity
a top of
candidates.
funnel issue.
Oh, absolutely. We have to be extremely thoughtful about the design of our diversity recruitment strategy. What tools do we use to bring in that top of funnel pipeline issue or fix that issue as best we can? And then how do we make sure that we're actually prioritizing diversity candidates when we have the opportunity and doing something different? So what I see companies doing is blind recruitment.
Yep.
They're removing names, they're removing location, schools, companies, so that we can really focus on who the individual is.
And getting to the bottom of that narrative that you were talking about.
Absolutely. So those are some ways that I see companies being really thoughtful about diversity recruitment, being smart about the resources that they can use. So when we think about it, it's setting the strategy, giving it time for us to go through and execute that strategy. And then lastly, making sure that we can actually measure it a year from now to see what did we do differently. And believe it or not, anytime I've seen them actually implement the Rooney Rule, they can go back and say like, oh, this is what we need to do. This is how we should move it moving forward. Here are the levers that we should pull in order to get closer to that goal.
Okay, I think this might be the hardest question. Now the CEO's not on board. They're not enlightened. But you are a senior manager, you really care about this. What can you do to sort of club them to death or her to death? I mean, what are the tools that you have to like sort of to bring more enlightenment around this issue?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of companies start creating D&I councils and sometimes
Like
it doesn't.
grassroots in the organization.
Yeah, grassroots approach, like, hey, we know this is an issue. Let's create a D&I council to at least start the conversation, which I think is great. But at some point, there does need to be some sort of leadership buy-in.
But maybe if you see 10 people on the leadership council in a 50-person company, you're like, that's 20% of my population believes enough to meet at lunch to talk about this.
Exactly. So that is a data point that CEOs will pay attention to and say, okay, hold on. They're taking this seriously. They're meeting and having conversations. How do we make sure that their voices are heard? I always say that you should have executive buy-in as well. So if not the CEO, then pick another senior leader in the organization that can champion this conversation when the leadership team meets. So I see them create a D&I council, set strategy and priorities for that D&I council around recruitment, hiring, talent management, whichever way you want to describe it, community relations, and then bringing in that executive leader that's like, no, this needs to happen, and maybe even willing to dedicate some of their budget to whatever they can in order to execute that goal until you get CEO buy-in.
Well, Melissa, this has been fantastic. You are such a lovely interview. You brought so much to bear in terms of best practices. We really appreciate what you're doing to make our world a better place.
Thank you. Appreciate it.